What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York calling from the altar again, and this time we are here with Paul of the Almighty Cynic. It is so great to be able to talk with you. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. It's so awesome to have you here, especially because last month, as a metalhead in my metal journey, it was just an epic honor and privilege to finally pop the Cynic cherry, as I've called it. It was my first time seeing Cynic, and to hear Focus performed in its entirety for the 30th anniversary, same age as me. It made for the best 30th birthday present. Do you feel like that this album, because when you I feel like that this album very much aged so well when you compare, Veil of Maya to I'm But a Wave 2 to Sediment. It seems like these songs really age well. Do these songs, though, have new meaning as, 30 years later, or do you still feel very much the same about it?
Yeah, I think when you revisit material, or at least for me, revisiting material that has, this span of, 30 years, it's like you start over again. I start over, I'm meeting it in a new way. So it curiously, I feel like that record is in its own timeline. It's not really related to like any age, it's not like it has this thing that it was, released in 1993, but it kind of could have come out today. It could have come out 50 years ago. It could come out in another 100 years. It's kind of like in its own weird dimension. And I felt that performing it, where I was like, wow, this music holds up because it's so trippy and unique and odd. It was doing so many things in a way that I don't think even we understood when we made it, that it just kind of exists, and it's not it's more about the vibration that it's emitting rather than like having to do with calendars. It's kind of in its own weird space. And so meeting it that way at night after night, I started to kind of connect with it, and I was like, damn, this stuff is its own thing. It's not part of any time or trend or, it's not part of any currency of a timeline. It's in its own weird dimension. And so it was kind of cool doing that in a live context, because you get to do it with an audience. You just like re-experience it again.
Yeah. And being that, the conceptual nature of this album was, perceiving the world as a whole, as well as, taking, I believe the title was influenced by George William Russell, the poet, if I'm not mistaken. And so by perceiving the world as a whole and using this philosophical and spiritual concept, do you think that in a live setting, that is the full Focus experience? It's one thing to listen to the album and get lost to it, but perceiving the world as a whole with the crowd interaction and that experience, that's really that's where Focus really comes to fruition.
I think so. It's like, this is where the music kind of perpetuates itself, is in real time in front of other humans, right? It's like it happens in the form of recordings, but when you go and perform this stuff, it's like it gets to exist again in a live thing. So it's kind of like it, yeah. And lyrically, in terms of what you're saying, it's not about current events. It's more of a spiritual kind of conceptual record that has to do with universal themes. And I think that's always been kind of inherent in Cynic's music. So it can kind of keep existing without any it's about this war that happened in 1995, or, it's not about that. It's kind of more of an internal, introspective kind of journey type of album. So it has that currency. It always applies, and that's pretty cool. I think I'm kind of so happy that that's where I was at lyrically in terms of that record, because it still has this kind of relevance that'll always kind of exist, right? It's the nature of being alive kind of stuff, rather than kind of trying to stay up with the times.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've always liked to say the way that when people say I'm not religious but I'm spiritual, I feel like when you analyze a concept, an album can be conceptual without it necessarily being a concept album. Fear Factory's Steam Manufacture, that's a concept album. Mastodon's Crack the Sky, that's a concept album. But I feel like with Focus, you played the album chronologically, but I feel like if maybe you started off with the Eagle nature, and then maybe you went right into the instrumental track of Textures and maybe started off with How Could I even, I feel like the significance and the emotional energy would still be very much the same. I don't think it would alter the narrative too much.
Yeah, we did the chronological thing in terms of staying with the sequence of the record for the sake of it. Just, that was meticulously chosen when we made the record in terms of the flow of songs. We figured keep that accurate in the live context. But I was just thinking the other day, with these other tours that are coming up, and some stuff in Europe next year, I was like, you know what, this could be shifted around. And like what you're saying, this song could be first and this one could be in the middle. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in order for it to kind of convey.
Going back to 1993 or even before when you were making this album, with having this introspective conceptual idea, was this something that you went into the making of Focus going like, this is what I want it to be about, and that helped determine the music in a way? Or did you prefer to like have the music and the tracks already written before the lyrical concepts came in? And this could go for any album that you've been on, not just Focus.
Yeah, the Focus was an interesting thing in that we had signed a record deal with Roadrunner in '92, and we were supposed to make the record. I think it was, around then. And then was it 91, 92? And then this hurricane came to Miami called Hurricane Andrew, which devastated the city. And it was literally our rehearsal space. Everything was just destroyed. And everyone, the city, it looked like a bomb, kind of set off. It was just pummeled. The whole place was leveled. And it was a year at least before kind of things got back to normal. And what happened in that year was that we had this dramatic period of growth, and it was all this time to flush out all these songs and kind of revisit this material that was going to be made the year prior. And it was this growth spurt that happened as a result of kind of like a mini, you could almost equate it to what happened in 2020 with people being locked inside. We had that with this hurricane, and we were just like playing our instruments, working on songs. And for me, I think spiritually, in terms of internal work, like I just devoured a bunch of literature and was meditating like a maniac. I mean, I still, this takes precedence in my life, but I felt like there were certain realizations and insights that happened in that year that made the album have a bit more maturity and insight, and kind of, it was a different degree of awareness, I think, that came as a result of that time of just being isolated. Mm-hmm. And in kind of an environment where I just had to live with these arrangements and live with this music. So absolutely, like there is that degree of like, it was there was a lot that went in. So by the time we went to show up and make the record, we weren't figuring things out on the fly. Mm-hmm. It was all like worked out. I mean, there were things that happened in the studio we were sorting out, like, oh, let's try this, or this doesn't work. Because the difference with that time basically also was that, you had 4 tracks in the 90s, you had 8 tracks, you didn't have like Pro Tools and DAWs, so you couldn't hear anything on a microscopic level. You'd get into the studio and it was like, holy shit, this sounds different than it did, in the rehearsal room. Suddenly you hear everything very clearly with a microscope. So things were being modified on the fly, but I think lyrically all that stuff was completely flushed out. I mean, maybe a word here or there, or but for the most part it was all considered.
Well, I think from Focus to Ascension Codes, every Cynic album has provoked thought and provoked energy, and really had that sort of introspective aspect behind it. And not even just with Cynic, but, of course, being on Human with Death. I mean, those are some of the most important songs in death metal. But, Eon Spoke as well is a very important track. But I wanted to ask this, if you don't mind, is that, one thing that I thought was so magical about this experience was it was a perfect celebration of both Sean Malone and Sean Reinert, who I never had the privilege of seeing perform. And so I just wanted to know, like, I think that is some of the most. You don't get a rhythm section like that. You can't replicate a rhythm section like that. And the way that they brought rhythm to it, they showcase that even with the rhythm section, have not really being reliant on melody, that they too can really convey a lot of emotion behind it. I just wanted to know, to pay tribute to such talented individuals, what was working with them like, in a way? Were you all kind of like, did you all have like a mutual vision on how Cynic should be, or did all of your individual experiences and talents, maybe being different, actually helped form Cynic's sound?
I mean, let me first off start by saying I feel so lucky that I was able to make music with these guys in my lifetime, because they were absolute masters, prodigious musicians playing at the highest level. And I really believe that, like, Malone and Reinert were absolute masters, and like complete the highest degree of like finesse, dexterity, ease, and just natural musicians that also were completely committed to excelling and having an incredible degree of like harmonic and melodic. And it's like, Reinert had a background as piano as a kid before he started playing drums. Like, he understood composition and arrangement. That's how he approached drum parts. Malone, it's like on a whole other level. He was like, to me, Bach meets Jaco Pastorius, like in the form of like, a modern rock metal bass player. He kind of forged this incredible classical compositional sense with like crazy groove, and the way him and Reinert connected was, I don't even think they understood the degree. It was like, so it was just this telepathic kind of organic symbiotic relationship where they just played as one, and they were so connected, and it was so profound. And yeah, it's so, yes, there was this thing where I didn't realize until, looking back, what was going on with those two. The degree of their connection musically, it was so profound, and then to listen, for example, with remixing Focus and doing this Refocus release, to go and listen to those bass and drum tracks isolated, they're like records in themselves without the guitars and vocals. It's insane. And I want to actually release that stuff, because it's mind blowing to hear just those two do their thing without the guitars and the vocals. Just, it's insane, And so I feel I'm so lucky that in this lifetime, I was able to play with musicians of this level, of this degree of kind of immense talent, and to be able to make music with them. I mean, what an honor, I mean, it's just like I think it's rare to kind of, working with, we all see this. It's collaborating with people is special, especially if you have some degree of like connection and where you're really collaborating. And we didn't realize what we had till later, how special that was, the degree of trust we had with each other as players. And you can't take that stuff for granted, where you just have this understanding, of how things work. And we had it since we were kids. So it was really an organic kind of thing that kind of evolved. And so I'm absolutely grateful for, being able to make music with these guys. And I think we did go in, with a record like Focus, there was a degree of like absolute clarity and precision and realized sense of what we were trying to do. At the same time, I think we were so engrossed in it that we didn't have that, like, it was just where we were. It was a reflection of where we were. It wasn't calculated. It was just completely an organic reflection, so there's that combination of being aware and having that, but also like kind of it being perfectly natural, and just like that's just where we were at as players. And we all had that. We fought like maniacs too, over how things should be, what an arrangement. But that inherent tension also produces interesting music historically in bands. So it creates this propulsion sometimes, right? And it's not until you look back, you're thinking, wow, all of that stuff was perfect inherently. It was exactly what it needed to be. The tension, the conflict, the beauty, all the dynamics, like it was it's just kind of seeing it all as exactly what it needed to be, and being grateful that we were able to make this work together for all those years. I feel really blessed in that sense.
And we all feel, as the metal community feels very blessed that we got to experience just all the music that they got to contribute to. It's an honor for us to listen to the music as much as it's an honor for you to have collaborated with them. So thank you to Malone and Reinert for everything you've done for us.
Yeah, man. And and I always say this, I've said this in other interviews, that this tour was more about honoring them in some ways than the 30th anniversary. 30th anniversary is just a calendar date, that we're using but really I lost these guys in one year, in the same year, in 2020. They both died, and it was tragic, and it ripped me apart to a point where I was completely devastated. I was so messed up and I'm still working through it. It's a watershed, life-changing moment to have that degree of loss in the same year with two people who I essentially forged my identity with. And so this has been more of a process of healing and bringing the experience of who they were back to the audiences in a way, like just to share their legacy, and say, these two motherfuckers, I want you guys to know what it was like to honor. And thankfully, I've got these musicians like Matt Lynch and Brandon that can execute their stuff with such precision and nuance and subtlety. They just are tuned in, and they knew these guys. Everyone's connected to them. So there's this degree of there's a certain relationship there that's not just random. So it feels like this is the whole thing. This is the therapy of this tour. It's like honoring these guys' lives and saying, hey, you guys, check out these dudes that did so much and were so connected to this legacy of this group, you know, and why that record is so special, essentially, too.
It almost seems like that this process of healing, first off, I think it's very inspirational that you were able to continue. I think that adds a whole other layer of how you could further inspire fans on, when darkness and agony descend, it's not about the agony and the darkness that we face that defines us. It's how we overcome it that defines us. And I think really just, if people weren't taking inspiration from Cynic before, I think we are taking inspiration from it now. And you're right. Shout out to Matt and Brendan for really being able to carry this torch. And the thing is, this introspective and this agony, I think that was the overall, I think we didn't just experience Focus in its entirety, but the way that this community we all grieved together and overcame so much. I think that's really what Focus was about. I think when we listen to Refocus now, we kind of I understand Focus now after, between 2020 and now, I understand it better now after experiencing that show.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and I will say this, you were saying about this idea of overcoming. Well, I had no intentions of ever surviving this. I thought it was over. And this all happened in the middle of making Ascension Codes, right? It was, during 2020. And I remember, Michael, who's been really a very supportive person, the president of Season of Mist throughout all of this. I remember just saying to him, it's over. I can't go on. I can't do this anymore. I'm if there is a sign from the universe to end this, it's now. I've just lost these guys. And somehow I think this idea for me, it was not only for the sake of survival, for my own sanity, to keep surviving as a human, but also thinking about these guys and the legacy they left. I was like, I gotta pick myself up and honor who they were. This is about the music. This is about, my brothers and their immense talents that they offered, their generosity to the world as musicians. And that's what gave me the strength to keep going, was thinking about them, and also this idea of pushing through. So I had to push through so much just to kind of find my way through. And I'm still amazed. I'm thinking, wow, I can't believe I'm doing this. I can't believe but I do understand now. It's this is what we're here to do. It's about the music. It's about celebrating art, right? This is why I'm here. I'm here to make music and to share it, right? And what better way to do that than to keep persevering in the face of loss and tragedy? This is the alternative is my own, giving up, my own kind of, foregoing, moving forward. And I don't want to do that, at least right now. I want to keep making music, man, this is, but man, yeah, it hasn't been, an easy journey. It's taken everything out of me, and I keep going, I don't know. I keep finding a way because I trust that I just put one foot in front of the other and trust that that's all I can do, and it's enough,
And again, truly inspirational. And I think that this should be like the perfect example of how we overcome adversity. But the thing is, too, and not to discredit everything that you just recently had to overcome, but I feel like part of Cynic's music was using darkness and demons as a means of inspiration, not just with Focus, but when you compare Traced in Air to Carbon-Based Anatomy, it seems like darkness has been the fuel to the fire and overcoming personal struggles. But I've always said that when that is the fuel to the fire, sometimes artists can become victimized by their own product in a way. So do you find that the songwriting process has been just as deteriorating as it's been cathartic, and how do you sort of write songs in the future to not succumb to the madness in the process?
I mean, those are great questions, and there's so many layers to what you're saying, and I'm going to do my best to unpack it to a degree, because yes, artists a lot, especially in these forms of music, tend to dramatize and romance the drama and the suffering, and there is a grace to it that, creates a window, a vehicle, a way to kind of turn this thing into something beautiful. That's what we're doing. We're constantly forging these elements of being alive into art. But at the same time, I think there's something to be said about finding a place of grace with it all, where you can see it as a dance. You see the play. You're not swallowed by it, where it becomes an addictive and destructive process, where you can actually celebrate this thing of making of music, this weird, mysterious thing of actually, because I don't think any of us understand where these songs come from. I can never pinpoint or intellectualize where music comes from. It just happens. And I feel like a lot of it is kind of preparing the vessel for whatever to come through. I can't say this is my stuff, these are my ideas. I'm just I literally had moments where I'm are these fucking aliens coming through me? What is this shit? Where does this stuff come from, right? It's where does the sound emerge from? Because I don't think we can claim ownership. We don't really own this. We're just using these instruments to kind of get sounds out, right? And Cynic especially is so, I don't know, I just show up. And so there's this fine line of trying to show up and not get too caught up in the story, to not buy into the story of what's happened in a dramatic way, but just to meet it and keep saying, the music is what the bottom line is here. This is what drives this process. Is I'm here to make music. I'm here to make art and to deliver this in the most pure way possible, and to try and tell the truth, and to try and meet this stuff in a way that has some integrity. And that's the goal. It has nothing to do with anything else other than showing up and just being authentic. So I feel like that this is where it's you have to kind of get beyond the me. You have to get beyond the life circumstances and trust that everything's unfolding exactly as it should, in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of these horrific things that seemingly have happened and continue to happen. I mean, look at human life. Look at the story of man. Go back in history. We've been doing this over and over again. We're still a warring people. We're still doing these atrocities to each other as a species. So you go, okay, this has been going on. These things, this is the nature of being alive, is how do you kind of meet it all and see it as a play, see it as to just see the appearances, see this thing, the nature of reality, with some degree of awareness and some lightness, with some humor, with some and trusting that it's all okay and that we all get to die somehow. We don't know. I mean, everyone's going to have this story and then they'll be talking about us if we're lucky, right? I mean, it's like, this is the nature of being alive. So it's just trying to meet this stuff with some degree of gentleness and compassion for oneself, and also seeing what's important and not getting too caught up, and that's where I keep pushing through. I'm like, okay, what do I want to do? I want to play my guitar. I want to write songs. How do I find a way to do that? Well, write more songs. keep making music, keep showing up, and just trust that whatever is unfolding is part of this journey. And at some point it ends, and you don't know when, unless you take your own life, right? It's like you don't know when this story will end, but we find purpose and meaning in making art and making music. This is what musicians do. This is why I keep doing this, because I like making I like writing music. This is, it's a figure eight. There's no means to an end. It's just what I do. It's my life,
But here's the debate I like to sort of have with artists in a way, do you believe inspiration, or to get that creative energy, is that really something that could be sought out? I know that you've explored literature and other mediums of art, which I think is awesome as a means of research, but is that creative energy, is that really something that you can go after, or is that something that just has to strike you?
I think it's a combination of things. The muse shows up when it shows up, and you have to heed the echo. At least I found, when it's there, ride that wave, because it's not always there. I also found that I have to disrupt patterns. I have to, and not in a destructive way, but in a way where sometimes it's good to move, to live somewhere else for a while. I did the nomadic thing for a year, and I'm considering it again, just to kind of get to see new things, to be out of those familiar places, because I need to so there's this balance of seeking out inspiration externally, while at the same time realizing I can make this music anywhere. You can put me in a cave in the Himalayas or in a little apartment in New York City, and I'm going to still write this music. It doesn't matter where I am. It's going to happen. But there is something to be said about being an organic being still. I'm not chipped yet. At least I don't know if I am. Maybe soon enough we will be, where I can still interact with my environment. And I do have to kind of keep that going. And there is this interaction that's going around for me constantly as a biological person, that's saying, how do I keep that momentum going? I have to keep disrupting things in a way that's mindful, that's not destructive to me, but also keeps that energy, that momentum. So I'm doing that all the time, little twists and turns to keep myself energized, and sometimes it is moving, sometimes it is shaking things up. It's kind of part of the process of being an artist, I think. And especially a band like Cynic, I'm not going to say try, the whole thing is to not repeat oneself. I don't want to fall into the pattern of, we have this language, we've forged this sound, now we're just going to make variations on a theme. That's the death of art. I want to keep moving forward. I want to expand. I want to make things I haven't done before. I want to keep challenging myself. So I have to go into these crevices, I have to go into the unknown. It's like you're going to the dark constantly and trying to figure out where the fuck you are. And so this is the task, is to keep pushing, to bring something new to the table. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm just writing on what I've done. And that sounds really dead and boring and uninteresting. I want to become a better musician. I want to become a better guitar player. I want to become a better songwriter. I want to do new things. I want to offer new things as a person alive on this planet. So how do I do that? I have to keep pushing myself forward. It's like you have to keep getting out of that cocoon, out of that comfort zone. It's work.
But sometimes you are working on a song for days, weeks, maybe months on end.
Years.
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy to think that, it was 15 years between Focus and Trace in Air. And when you work on something for a long period of time, does it maybe make it a little bit more difficult to maintain that initial spark of the idea in a way? Do you like to maybe feel the same way when you finish something as you do when you start it?
Oh, absolutely. And there's some times where I know if I don't finish this now, like it's like there's a couple different approaches for me with songwriting. It's like get it done while you're in that moment. At least get the whole like the germ of the idea solidified, because it'll lose that momentum otherwise. But that's what's so interesting with songs, at least for me, is that they tell you when they're ready. And I haven't, constantly in my subconscious or somewhere percolating in there, these ideas that are germinating that could be 3 years old, 5 years old, like who knows? They just exist in the ether. And then they show up and they're like, this song's ready to get done. And it's telling you now to get it done. And so I'll go and revisit it. And it's like, oh, now that's weird. That one little riff thing that had this melody is now ready to get finished. And I had put it aside for a while. And so there's always this like, a basket full of ideas that I'm pulling from, and some they just tell you when they're ready. So, but you have to be ready to listen, you have to keep that kind of the vessel kind of clear. So that when it shows up and says, I'm getting, it's time to get me finished. You got to be ready to make it happen. Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of, you know what I mean? Both those things, because there is the work ethic of just showing up and kind of, ushering in the energy, but also creating space and letting ideas germinate and trusting that they kind of have a life of their own and they tell you when they're ready. And I think those are the best ones because they kind of find themselves over the course of time rather than forcing them. Do you know what I mean? It's Absolutely. Like giving it space. It's like, editing, you reread something over and over and you tweak and you go, oh, and you catch things that you didn't catch on the first read or second read. And it's like that with songs. It's like you suddenly have all these perspectives and you just get to like refine an arrangement to where it feels like, okay, now it's ready, and it takes time to kind of, you've got to give it space. I always tell people, be patient. What's the rush, man? Just like take your time, man. Make it good. Like, don't worry about just pumping things out.
There's a lot of hardcore kids who could definitely use some words of wisdom from you. How are we doing on time? I have 2 more questions, if that's cool.
Yeah, I'm good, man.
Awesome. Depending on what the material could be about, though, like Focus being more introspective, or Kindly Bent to Free Us, which I feel like has almost kind of like its own epic space sort of storyline in a way, or even Human, which you didn't do vocals on, but even that has interesting conceptual meaning as well, and big shout out to Chuck Schuldner as well. Like, depending on what the material could be about, does it resonate with you differently, or does it maybe hit differently when you perform that or revisit it?
Oh, absolutely, man. Yeah, it hits differently almost every night, where I'll get suddenly like, oh, now I see that line as, because when I sing the words, especially, in a live context, it's like I'm trying to meet the lyrics in that moment again. It's not like I'm just pumping out, a formula. It's like you do get to where it's a muscle memory thing, especially singing and playing these complex parts. But those words, like they have new meaning depending on where I'm at this point in time. It's like, so I'm constantly doing that with these songs, constantly like, oh, and it's funny how, some songs, I don't get what they're about till years later, where I'm like, oh, that's what that's about. It was just because you're just in that process of channeling some kind of message and you don't even know what the hell it is, but it makes sense in the moment to just write these words. And then it's years later that I'm like, oh, okay. Cause this is, this is where I have trouble intellectualizing art. It's like, I can tell you what I think a song's about, but really it's what your experience of it is that matters most. Cause everyone's having their own, subjective experience of songs. This is what's so interesting. This is why a sad song can make someone feel uplifted and an uplifted song can make someone feel sad. It's like you're bringing yourself to it. It's this mirroring thing, because we're all like one organism experiencing this thing in real time. So I'm like, always, I have that too with the songs where I'm like, oh, okay, that song, like Kindly Bent, that whole record has this whole thing that I feel like I've been starting to get in a different way. Some of those tunes, I'm like, holy shit, okay, that's what that, because that was a very peculiar time in my life. And now I'm like reflecting on it going, oh, so yes, you're constantly meeting this stuff in a new way, and you're understanding it differently as over time. It's.
And especially because when I was at the show in New York City at Le Poussin Rouge, I was so focused in the present, no pun intended. I was so in the present, but like, and I could tell that you're very focused too. That pun is going to happen a lot, but but like, I could tell that you're very in the moment in a way, but you're bringing songs, because you didn't just perform Focus, you played some songs off of Ascension Codes and Trace and Air and Kindly Bent. So like, when you play the material live, does playing a Focus song almost maybe bring a sensation like you're back in 1993, or playing a Trace and Air song almost bring a sensation back like you're in 2008, etc.?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't have calendar references in that sense. Like, it's almost like I meet it in real time, and then it becomes this work that exists outside of like linear time. It's like it's just art happening. And that has nothing to do with the calendar. It has to do with just this thing, these sounds that exist, as like a painting will exist or something. It's just kind of. And it's curious when you think about it in terms of linear time, like, oh, this was made back then, and these things were going on in the world or whatever as reference points. But as the artist performing it, it's so interesting. You really transcend time. It's like it becomes this, it really lives in its own dimension. It like sets up its own, like realm around it, and then it's like has nothing to do with calendars anymore. It's just art happening, which is really, I think, the point of it, right? It's like you're trying to transcend time and space and say something that resonates.
Of course. And also too, and this leads me into the sort of the final portion of the interviews, because you have multiple forms of instrumentation, being both a vocalist and a guitar player. And I've always been admired by your guitar tone as inspired by your voice as well. So do you express yourself with the guitar in a different way than you do vocally? Can you maybe express a side of yourself on a vocal level that you can't with a guitar, and vice versa?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first off, I always describe myself like people, if I'm meeting someone that I don't know and they're like, oh, like I'm a musician, mm-hmm. This is the words we use to describe what we do. And then they'll be like, oh, are you a singer? And I'm like, no, I'm a guitar player that happens to sing. And I always viewed it that way. Like the vocal part, I'm a guitar player first, always. And the vocals are almost like another instrument to me. It's not like singer, I've never been a singer. I love singing, and I've gotten into really connecting with melody and getting into something really authentic with my voice, because I essentially emerged as a reluctant singer. Focus was vocoder because I was so insecure about my voice as melodically. I could growl, those last demos, but melodically I was so terrified that I could hide behind this like trippy alien synth voice that I ended up being a really cool thing. And I was like, this is the sound that makes sense to me if I'm going to do a melodic voice. And then I moved through finding an authentic voice without effects, something very pure and natural. But it's at the same time, it's like, it's still, I approach a voice as an extension of the music, that you can use words to tell the story, but the guitar line has just as much relevance. This is why, I've always been a fan of instrumental music. It's like the melodies with with any instrument melodically can have as much weight. You're telling a story with the instruments as much as you are with the words. It's all interconnected. They're all like one organism. And especially in the context of Cynic, it's always been about that. It's like the space, the vocal, the guitar, they're all kind of interacting. And sometimes you're doing a guitar melody instead of a vocal melody to say the same thing, but it's using the language of sound rather than words, right? It's so it's, yeah, they all kind of interact and interplay, and I see them all as one thing kind of happening rather than like, here's the bed of music and now let's put a vocal on it. It's never been like that with Cynic. It's the vocal's kind of an extension of everything. It's just all kind of one.
Well, most singer slash guitar players I've either interviewed or researched, most of them didn't start off singing and playing guitar. Like Dave Mustaine, he was cornered into being the vocalist. Matt Heafy of Trivium, your case. I feel like if you pick up the guitar, and this isn't to discourage anybody who has these dreams or aspirations, but if your intention is to pick up the guitar and be like, I want to be exactly like James Hetfield, that doesn't really work. James Hetfield, he started off in Metallica just doing the vocals. So, like,
right.
it kind of like...
Yeah, you find your way. And I think for a lot of us, especially if we're like, it's just you gravitate towards whatever instrument makes the most sense. And I was a reluctant front man. I was a reluctant singer. I wanted to just play my guitar. I still just want to play my guitar. But I stepped into it, out of necessity. And it's become a great joy, but at the same time, would I be happy just laying low and playing my guitar? Absolutely.
Well, hey, your solo work is incredible, and the instrumental songs on all the Cynic albums are just as thought-provoking as well. So great instrumental music, but we do need your voice, so don't abandon it.
Thank you. And by the way, Poussin Rouge, that show was so cool. I mean, I have to say, it was a really great night for us. We did a lot of shows on that tour, but that night definitely stood out. It was like, there was something about the vibe in New York was just fire, it was rad.
That was the best month for me on a personal level I've ever had for live music, because I got to cross off a lot of bucket list bands this year. Within a month, I saw Biohazard with the reunited lineup. Cool. I saw Emperor, and I saw you guys. So wow. I thought that was an awesome bucket list.
That's rad.
And there was one bonus question I did want to ask, actually pertaining to that tour, because I feel like when it comes to Florida death metal, we always, of course, think of the Morbid Angels and the Deicides and Obituaries and whatnot. But I always thought that with you and Death and Atheist, you were almost kind of like a scene within a scene in a way. Like whether we call you progressive metal or technical death metal or something like that, it isn't just the standard obituary guttural death metal sound that we hear. Was that like a vision that either you or Chuck Schuldner or Kelly sort of had in a way? Did you all form your bands being like, we're gonna take we're gonna take what we have with death metal and we're gonna bring some elements of Yes in it, or bring some elements of Pink Floyd in it or something?
I think, especially Atheist and Cynic, we were outsiders. We were in a scene that was doing this extreme music, especially in Central Florida. We were Miami kids, so we were more from the city down south, like 3-4 hours south of where all that stuff was really kind of emerging. And we felt really outside, because we were listening to every kind of music. We had eclectic tastes. We were just geeking out on jazz and world music and pop and funk and just all over the place, and you'd go up there and it was just metal was just the way. It was so extreme, especially Central Florida. And we had this extreme metal thing too, but we were also interested in merging, all these other things. So, but I think we felt, I think it was a result of a couple of things. One was we were just weird kids, that had weird inclinations and interests that kind of organically developed into songs that were the culmination of these musicians and these artists making these sounds. And it was just who we were. We weren't trying. And the other thing was, I remember there was an intention as a musician that was developing some skill to not rip off people. I was it's so easy to rip off bands. And I was hearing all these Metallica and all those early thrash and speed metal bands. There were so many kind of bands just doing these knockoffs of those sounds. And I was like, I want to, I was into like the Voivods and the bands that were like off the beaten path that were doing some weird ass shit. And I was like, that's my inspiration. I want to do something weird and new and different. So like if I, and I would say this to students and stuff working on songs, it's like if you have two ideas and one feels more generic and the other one feels more fresh and original, but it's off the beaten path and doesn't feel as user friendly, take the risk, go in the other direction, because that'll lead you somewhere. If you do the familiar thing, it's kind of like, it's so easy to just do, especially once you get some chops as a musician, to rip off things. Like I could write Morbid Angel, Metallica rip off songs all day long. But it's not interesting.
It's like, let me guess what your favorite band is. The band you sound exactly alike.
Exactly. And that's always happening in the scenes, these bands that kind of, and some bands curiously start out that way and then they kind of find their sound over the course of records. I mean, look at, for example, which is an interesting example, is Meshuggah. I mean, I think Frederick was always outside as a Holdsworthian motherfucker of a guitar player with an outside harmonic language. But those early records, you can hear the trajectory before they kind of forged this gent thing. And I don't know which was the first record that was the beginning of that, but it was a process and it happened. And it's so interesting to witness what happened with them because they created a whole world, that kind of emerged. But I think it was inevitable for that band. But no, I felt like we, Atheist and Cynic especially, because Death had more traditional death metal roots. They were like doing, although they were kind of doing it in a way that was very accessible. It was like the thing with Chuck and those early Death records, that it was catchy. It was like memorable kind of riffs and melody, like phrasing with the growls that was accessible. He had a songwriting sensibility that wasn't common in death metal at the time. And I think it was what made them stand out and keep it, and then he got into the more technical stuff. When we got in the human thing, we started to kind of, he found a new thing rather than trying to be more brutal. It was like he got more musical and technical, which I think was a path that made Death's trajectory interesting because they started to evolve.
I've always said that the most technical Death album was The Sound of Perseverance, the last one, because of that sort of timeline, what you just mentioned.
Exactly. No, but Atheists were like, Kelly Schaefer, he like was an older brother to us that heard us early on and like basically took us under his wing and started championing Cynic and saying, check out these kids from Miami, they're doing some weird shit. and next thing you know, we did some shows with them and we kind of developed this brotherhood because we felt like outsiders in the scene. We felt like we were the weird bands in a scene that was kind of, although I will say, which is so fascinating, if you look at the snapshot of, especially because there was the Florida scene and then there was the Scandinavia, there was the two kind of emerging death metal scenes. And Florida scene was, I don't know how to explain it, but if you look at each band that came out, they were all kind of doing their own trippy twist on things. They all had their own like sub-genre sounds that became their own little scenes, right?
Yeah.
But Cynic and Atheist were even further out. We were just like the outsiders of the outsiders in already a very subculture-y scene. And we felt it, especially back then, because there wasn't a lot of love for us. People were just like, what are these clean parts? And what are you singing about? Why aren't you singing about, gory things? We were singing about nerdy things, it was like, so it was a hard road back then because we didn't fit in.
Yeah. And I think, one band in New York that had, because New York with Cannibal Corpse and Immolation and, Malignancy and Immortal Suffering, and shout out to Viserion and Solemn Vision and all the modern bands keeping it alive nowadays. But like Suffocation was kind of like the band that was bringing in that, not progressive, but like their more technical side behind it as well. So
definitely. Yeah. They were like one of the early like like reps of tech death, if you think about it.
Yeah.
And especially like super fast, the blast stuff. I mean, that was suffocation. It was like they were just like pushing the envelope, but those riffs were crazy.
Terrence Hobbs is subhuman. I don't know how I don't know how he does it. Shout out to him, and shout out to Peavy for that incredible tone. So
I know. So cool.
Yeah. So before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time today. Most of all, thank you for continuing Cynic and continuing to give us great, excellent music, and for this amazing tour. Just, is there anything else with Cynic that you'd like to promote other than Refocus in terms of upcoming shows? If this will be uploaded by midnight tonight, so if you have
awesome.
Yeah, so if there's like a anniversary tour scheduled for 2027 or something like that, don't plug it here.
No, I mean, we're leaving in a couple weeks to go do Southern dates to kind of all the like places we didn't play on this tour. We're doing 4 Florida shows. The first show's in Miami, which is like a full circle hometown gig, September 1st. And then we're also doing that festival, Prague Power in Atlanta. So it's kind of like a little Southern run, New Orleans, and then 4 Florida shows. But other than that, I think laying low, I've been working on music and kind of just kind of staying, you know, in a creative process. You know, it's kind of what I do when I'm not touring. Touring's like a different mode. And then we're planning on picking up activity again next year. We're doing like a Europe run next March.
Oh, sweet.
And and there's music developing behind the scenes, but I don't like to say too much until it's like closer. But yeah, always writing and working on stuff.
Hell yeah. Well,
great to chat with you, bro. Yeah, thank you.
It was an honor. Thank you, everybody. Paul of Cynic. Be sure to check out Ascension Codes, the latest new material, and be sure to check out Refocus if you haven't already. This is Alex from Heavy New York, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Alex.